Today we're talking about PWAs versus native apps. I assume most of you are in like the native space, given the type and title of this meetup. I'm going to have to do some education, and we'll start with that on what PWAs are exactly, and then we'll kind of shoot back and forth on some of the key areas to do with each of them, and when you might pick one over the other. I am Leigh. I'm a lead developer here at Hatchd. Aranda and I share an office space upstairs there. I primarily work on web apps and websites. And Aranda, what do you do?
Yeah, I'm Aranda Morrison. I'm the tech director with Adapptor. I code occasionally, not as much as I'd like to, and just help generally the tech team and delivery with Adapptor. Yeah.
Cool. So what is this elusive acronym that I've put up here? Whoa, progressive web app. So what does that mean? A progressive web app is an app that's built using web platform technologies, but that provides a user experience like that of a platform-specific app. So the TLDR is it's a website or web app that feels like a native app. So what's the difference between a web app and a progressive web app? So there's a couple of main things that sort of give you that checkbox of approval to sort of graduate to being a progressive web app. So the main one being that PWAs are installable. So what that means is you get a fancy little browser prompt that shows up when you visit a website that is PWA compatible. You may have seen that before. The way that that presents itself on a website has sort of changed over the years. It used to be a very obvious toast type notification. And I feel like that would deter people from clicking a lot of the time, just because it's very in your face, and people like it's like websites when they ask for permission to send you notifications and stuff like that. It's quite often the sort of thing that you just I don't want to do that right now. But over the years, things have improved a little bit more, and you can customize that install process. So you can do things like this on an Android device where you provide images, and you get this sort of install prompt that looks similar to like the Google Play Store, for example. So once you install a PWA, it actually looks more or less the same as a native app, as in you get an icon on your home screen, you can see things like notification badges and stuff like that. For all intents and purposes, it looks and feels like a native app.
Yeah, but to be fair, this is still one of the main hurdles for PWAs, really. People don't really know, when you see this little icon flash in your browser toolbar, what does that actually mean? If I click it, it'll do something. Is it going to save a link onto my desktop? Or what it's actually going to do is create a local app, which is bundled the website as a local app that you can run potentially offline. That's one of the main hurdles they're still facing.
So the other thing that is generally associated with PWAs is that they work offline. And the asterisk there is you still have to do the work to make it work offline. You don't just magically get an offline app when you make a PWA. So what is actually required to actually have something that the browser prompts you to install as a PWA? There's a few things that you need. The first one is a web app manifest. The second one is that it's running in a secure context, and the third one is that you need a service worker. So the web app manifest is the JSON that looks something like this. So this is the very basic example of what you actually need, which is a name, at least one icon that represents the little app icon that shows up when you install it, a start URL, which is the URL typically to your website. Sometimes you might add a little query parameter on the end there, so you can track things and know that people have installed your app via a PWA. And you also have a display mode as well. So there's a couple of different options there, but typically you'd pick standalone. That's the one that makes it look like a native app, so you don't have the browser Chrome around it. And then you register that manifest by providing a link to it in your HTML document, and that's essentially all you need. And then, obviously you have to be running in a secure context, so that is just HTTPS or localhost. So when you're developing locally, you will also be able to register and see a PWA. The next thing is a service worker. So this is sort of a complementary piece. I believe Chrome now doesn't actually require a service worker to be registered for the PWA prompt to show up, but it's quite often an integral part of a PWA. So what it tends to offer most of the time is offline functionality. So it acts as a sort of proxy in the middle of your application and your network layer. It'll take any requests for assets, whether that be images or CSS, HTML, JavaScript, and you can basically set up different caching rules based on that, like a regex of a path or anything like that, and choose when to serve something from a cache versus going to the network to fetch it. And that enables basically 100% offline experiences.
What about fallbacks? So if it attempts to connect and can't, will it then just fall back to the cache? Is that?
Yeah, so I mean that's all rules that you can set up as well. So there's different strategies with caching. So you can say prefer the network, prefer the cache, and provide fallbacks when things go wrong. And it looks like a little bit like this. So this is what a service worker typically consists of at a very basic level. So typically you'd want to cache what is known as your app shell. So just the very basic files that you need for your application to run, which might be an HTML file, which is delivered at the root, some styles to make it look pretty, and some JavaScript. And you have a bunch of different event listeners that you can hook into. This example here is using the install event to grab all those resources, cache them when the service worker is installed. So that's the first time a user visits the website in question. This install event listener will run, and they will install all the resources, and they will be able to access that offline. And then, you just need a tiny bit of JavaScript to register that service worker, which is just a path to that file, essentially. In terms of comparison of different features, we've got about 10 different areas which we're going to talk through. So development cost and speed. I think PWA has the edge here, just because it's a single code base, and in terms of developers who have familiarity with the web, I believe outweigh those who know specialty languages like Kotlin and Swift for native. And according to the 2023 Stack Overflow Dev Survey, that is proven by the numbers. So we've got 6.6% front-end developers versus 3.38 mobile, JavaScript 65%, HTML 52% versus 9.7, 4.96 on Swift and Kotlin. The inroad to setting up a PWA is easier as well, just because if you already have an existing website, you can turn that into a progressive web. You can incrementally adopt and sprinkle in features like offline support as you go. And in terms of setting things up, that makes your life a little bit easier, especially if you already know the web.
Yeah, well, I can't really argue with that. If you have a team that is building a website already and want to bring it to a more mobile experience and make use of some mobile specific features, then certainly PWAs are a good option there.
Another thing is just overall cost of development. If you're spending less time on a single code base, tends to cost less money. I would hope so, unless something's gone horribly wrong. Deployment. PWA probably again has the edge here. It's just a website at the end of the day. There's a myriad of hosting providers out there now that make us as developers' lives easier. We don't have to worry about all that DevOps business anymore. There's platforms like Versal and Netlify, which you essentially just hook up a Git repo and away you go. You've deployed your website. Updates to your applications, they don't need approvals. By approvals, I mean approvals from app stores. So if you're submitting your app to the Apple App Store, I'm sure Aranda knows all about the joys of that process. We can go full cowboy mode with the web and just push code like Waze do, or did.
It's kind of a double-edged sword, isn't it? Like, yes. In a way, the App Store release cycle forces you to take things a bit more slowly, and you need to do your QA properly and make sure that you've got it all tested and ready to go before you push it to the app stores and then release to your customers.
And a little tidbit as well, Microsoft actually maintain a website called PWAbuilder.com, which lets you actually just provide a link to your website, and as long as you've got an app manifest similar to the one that I showed before, they'll actually spit out native app bundles for you as well, so you can actually submit your PWA to a native app store as well.
Depends what you mean by native app there, really, doesn't it?
It's probably just a website in a wrapper, but let's just forget about that.
It goes on the store, so that's something.
Yeah, so you have that visibility that you would get out of a native app. Device support. So I guess maybe a 50-50 here. It's going to depend on browsers at the end of the day, so you're going to have the same support that you have from a website running in a browser. But that also means that you have millions of different screen sizes and devices that you can support as well, again, from the same code base. But you're also subject to the same cross-platform quirks that are, if you've done any web development, you'd know there's can be a few headaches cross-browser, but now everything's Chromium these days, so that's sort of going away a little bit more. And Apple as well tend to be a little bit less on board with PWAs as a whole, so they can be a little bit slower to adopt new features and technology support.
Yeah, so fragmentation's a bit of a problem here with native apps as well, but with PWAs you're looking at fragmentation of all the web browsers and then the mobile app devices and then the different types of browsers on the mobile apps as well. So your Samsung and Chrome and the various other ones on Android.
And maybe one day there'll be different rendering engines on iOS as well. But it's just Safari for now. Even though you're using Chrome, it's still Safari. Offline support, pretty good with PWAs. You can do most of what you would need to do to provide a good experience in like an area with a spotty network connection. But again, you're limited by what the browser lets you do, and in terms of how much you can actually store. Again, Apple coming to the party here and doing some weird stuff. That in Safari, you have a 1 gigabyte limit of storage by default. And once you hit that limit, you can go over it, but you get like a little native prompt that comes up and says, this application's requesting more than 1 gigabyte, and you have to sort of approve 200 megabyte increments of increases to the storage. Of course, if you had like a long-running task, you wouldn't have to tap that button a million times to keep feeding in more data, but it's a little bit of a weird UX thing, which obviously a native app isn't going to have.
I guess that one, at least, you mentioned to me that you need to think about offline first. If you're doing a PWA and you want it to support that, it's good to think of that from the start, whereas with a mobile app, that's the default. You're offline first, and then you're adding online capabilities as you build them.
Yeah, that's definitely true, and it is definitely a lot more work to introduce that later on down the line. So yeah, good point. Background processors are still a little bit in their infancy with iOS again. Apple's ruining our good times. So background sync doesn't currently work in iOS, which is unfortunate, but it does in Google Chrome on Android devices. OS feature access. This is one where native apps are clearly going to win out. We do have a lot of things in the pipeline for the web, such as Bluetooth, USB, ambient light sensors, and vibration and haptics. But they're all under feature flags in browsers, so you have to go in and turn it on, and no one's actually going to have that stuff enabled. So we definitely can't rely on features like that at this point in time. But we do support things like geolocation, although not things like geofencing, because we can't do any background stuff. But we can also access things like the camera and microphone, obviously.
This is definitely one where if you want to know what your roadmap holds, and if it's got anything to do with background, geolocation, or any background processing at all, or some of these more like Bluetooth heavy kind of operations, then probably want to steer clear from PWAs initially. Another point on this is that as the OS has released new versions, they release cool new features. For example, iOS has got their live activities where you can see things happening. Your app can do home screen updates in real time, and the little what's it called? The island, live island.
The dynamic
island. That's the one. Yeah, not an iOS user, sorry. And you can't really make use of those from a PWA at all. So again, if you want to have that really kind of native user experience for your users, then you want to go native or a framework that is built on top of native.
User experience, from a user's perspective, if they do open a PWA alongside of native a lot of the time they won't be able to tell the difference because aesthetically they will look the same. I saw you squint. Performance-wise, that might be a different story, and obviously rendering performance of native is always going to be better, and there's just nothing that we can do about that, being that one step removed on the web. So obviously we've got a browser in between that ruins the performance for us. But having said that, like it's not terrible, and we're not unless you're doing anything crazy that requires like lots of compute and GPU.
Yeah, I'd probably
juice.
agree. Like 90% of apps would probably be fine, but where you do need to do rendering or possibly really complex animations, and you want it to look really smooth and nice, then you might run up against issues in the browser context. We've got also here about in-app purchases. So unless you're doing the whole bundle it as a native app and put it on the store, then you don't have to go through Apple's kind of hoops of, or use the in-app purchase on the store, which is kind of a double-edged sword in a way, because there's the whole Epic versus Apple thing where they're pushing you out of the app stores if you don't want to take the 30% fee from Apple with their in-app purchases for digital products. But at the same time, they're making it harder for you to put your things like PWAs on a device, which, we'll touch on in a minute as well.
Yep. Probably another advantage that PWAs have is just their overall footprint in terms of once you've actually installed it to your machine. I did a little bit of a comparison with Spotify, the desktop app, which I know is, I think, an Electron app, so it's still web-based for the native experience. But that's a 310 megabyte application on your machine versus 330 kilobytes for the PWA version of it. So obviously that'll grow as caches increase and stuff like that, but that initial install is dramatically smaller. So if you've got, a low-powered device or a spotty network connection, that could be definitely advantageous. Push notifications, they work. As of last year across all the latest versions of iOS and Android. So this is a relatively new addition. If we did this presentation a year ago, you would have had the argument of, haha, they don't work in iOS, but they do now. So haha. I say haha.
Can I say aha anyway?
You can, sure. Discoverability. PWAs, you're mostly going to be relying on SEO and Google and how you're going to rank, and obviously there's a lot more competition there in terms of the web is a big place with lots of websites out there, and there's no real, I guess, trusted source for browsing PWAs. It's just they're on the internet and you can install them versus native, which have a nice little app store that you can browse.
Yeah, and that's where people expect to go for something they call an app. So that's again, touched on that before with the whole discoverability and user experience. It's probably going to be a little while before I think PWAs or apps installed from the web become a standard part of people's expectations.
Yep, definitely some education still needed, which hopefully this is some form of. So we thought we'd just chuck in a few screenshots of real-world examples of PWAs. Duolingo. Obviously, they have a native app, which works great on phones, but there's no desktop counterpart or large screen version unless you try and install the iPad version through macOS, which I tried and I couldn't log into. It threw some weird error. So there's the web version, which functions exactly the same as the native app. I'm not 100% sure what the underlying tech is for these guys, but I found this a great experience to use. Starbucks, if you like overly sugary coffees, you can install their PWA. WhatsApp, and funny story here, we discovered that we were using the opposite versions of the tech that we're advocating for. So I had the native version of WhatsApp installed, and Aranda had the PWA installed, and he didn't actually know there was a native app. So
that's right. I pressed that little install button on WhatsApp web, and I didn't realise I'd been using. Well, I thought, that works better now. I can just press this home icon. It turns out it's a PWA all along. He's using the native app.
You got conned by the install button. Spotify, which is also an insight into my taste in music. Left and right tell the difference. There is none. That's the PWA on the left-hand side, I believe, and the native app on the right-hand side. And again, that's what an installed PWA looks like of Spotify on your home screen, virtually indistinguishable from the native app. There's some weird visual issues here, so I guess that's the giveaway for the PWA there. The little iOS bar thing gets in the way of like a persistent bottom navigation, so yeah. So who wins? It depends, I guess, on what you're trying to build. As we touched on before, if you're running a bit more lean and you have prior web experience, PWA definitely makes sense because you've got all the tools you need to get started, and to make something that's actually installable is very little code, and the ongoing support for that, there's a lot of tooling and frameworks about to help you with that. I didn't touch on that before, but there's a library that Google maintains called Workbox, which makes your life easier with maintaining service workers, basically. So that's one. But I guess at the same time, a con is that you're still sort of at the whim of browser vendors and operating systems and their level of support for PWAs and just web in general features. We heard about the thing recently with Apple in the EU, where there's all this backlash with third-party app stores, and they ended up just pulling support for PWAs.
So in the iOS 17.4 beta, they released an update that essentially disabled PWAs. So if you had one installed or installed one, it just became like a normal old link to a website on your home screen. There was a bit of backlash, and they eventually now have in their documentation it's saying, okay, yeah, all right, we'll let you keep doing that, sorry.
So yeah, you very much have to worry about Apple chucking a tantrum, which is a little bit concerning. But yeah, they're only going to get better over time. Like as I mentioned before, push notification support was a recent addition, and yeah, gradually Apple are starting to play ball a little bit more with supportive features. So it's good to see.
But also you want to make sure you know your roadmap and what you want to build, what your features you want to target for your customers, because you don't want to be spending lots of time on a nice PWA and realizing, oh, now we have to build it in native anyway because of some feature we need.
Yeah, or you can just do both, like a lot of the companies that we've shown do as well.
That's true, yeah. If you've got deep pockets, you just do both.
Just do everything. Yeah, so that's it. Questions?
So the cache that the service worker accesses, is that part of the RAM, or does the browser save it in non-volatile memory?
Yeah, so it'll save it in non-volatile memory. So it'll go onto the disk in the same sort of cache directory that the browser would maintain it anyway.
Right.
Yeah.
And what sort of challenges did you face when catering to different browser engines?
Used to be lots. It's sort of gone away a little bit these days because there are really only two major players in the space now, which is like Safari or WebKit, and Chromium, which I believe their engine is called Blink. And a lot of browsers like Edge are just using that underlying browser engine. So supporting multiple browsers is somewhat less of a headache as it was in the past.
Like I heard that Firefox rebuilt their web browser engine with Rust language for performance. So did you see any improvement in performance?
Honestly, I don't use Firefox all that often, and it has such a small market share that it's often not worth putting a significant effort into building things for. But yeah, I'm interested to check that out for sure.
There is this new thing by Apple called App Clips that also looks like PWAs. Can you shed some light on that, RJ?
I think that's probably an Aranda question.
Yeah, so those would strictly be a native, it's like a mini app. A native mini app has to be under maybe a certain like 10 megabyte payload, and it's installed and run automatically from a particular type of link, and it's deployed with your app bundle. So you have to build it, opt in to build it as like an extension to your app and deploy it with your app, and then it can open and be like a precursor to your app. So I guess like a quick and easy way to get users in without actually going to the App Store. Android have a similar one called Instant Apps, I think it's called. But actually we haven't seen a huge amount of take-up of these new technologies. And potentially, you can actually do a similar thing with either a website or maybe a Flutter for Web experience. So if you've got a Flutter app, maybe you can deploy a Flutter for Web like initial guest experience, which runs and then funnels people into your native app. So yeah, I'm not sure why exactly, but I haven't seen a huge amount of these instant apps and app clips in the wild.
The way you describe it looks like a wild west that anyone can download a PWA and install and start using. How does it work with security? Because if there is nothing control it, does it mean that we can have access of few things on the computer that we shouldn't have access and damage whatever? Or
so it's exactly the
exploit it?
same as a website running in a browser. So the same level of security measures and precautions that you have to take is the same as when you're building a website. The level of access is not quite as deep as what you would get from a native app anyway. So there's a lot of sandboxing going on with browsers and what you can and can't access. That also naturally applies to PWAs as well.
With the one that you mentioned a while ago with PWA, I try to view it like a hybrid mobile app because that's how I view it, hybrid mobile app versus native app, right? But if I'm not mistaken, with Ionic, React.js, and all other hybrid apps available, how will PWA, those kind of apps, would fare against those that are existing right now? Because if I'm not mistaken, those hybrid apps already have their own challenges against native apps, and this is a new one. So it's like reinventing the wheel, but like they're on a different path. How would that fare?
Yeah. That's a good question. I wouldn't say it's new. I think PWAs as a thing have been around for at least 10 years. It's just the adoption and knowledge of them has been sorely lacking. I think as to how they compare to other frameworks that are doing similar native type things, you can still use those frameworks to build PWAs as well. So you could use React to build a PWA, and quite often you would as well, because it ties in very nicely to, I guess, that single page app, so app-like website experience. Those frameworks do very well. And then you kind of have that extra layer of being able to install it and have it show up like a native app on your device without actually having to publish it to an app store as well, which would be one of the key differentiators versus using like an Ionic or something where you still have to go through the native app marketplace.
It's still built with web technologies, but they've provided you like a native interface layer to use those native features, like the device sensors and things that the PWA browser apps are still segregated from. If you're building with Ionic, you're using web technologies, but you can utilize more of the native features once you deploy onto the store. PWAs, if you've got a website, you don't need any of those native features, you just want it to feel like more of a native experience, then that would work as a PWA. Whereas if you still want to build in a web framework technologies, but you need a bit more of that native functionality, then it might be something along the lines of Ionic. Yeah. Or you could go full React Native if you can build in React and then get native UI as well. Or just go Flutter. So no, don't do that. Sorry, I love C#, but I think Xamarin's officially deprecated now. So
Cool. Round of applause, guys. Thanks.